So, good morning. Thank you very much for coming. Before we start our Scholar Talk today, I would like to acknowledge that we all meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm here on Gadigal land where I live, work and write, and where this comparatively young library, the State Library of New South Wales, sits on the lands of one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I pay my sincere respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who are here with us this morning. Thank you all very much for coming. We've got a lovely crowd here this morning. Nobody here is distracted by horse racing. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks. I'm the coordinator of scholarship here at the State Library, and that means I get to look after the library's fabulous cohorts of fellows. Today is the last Scholar Talk for 2022, and we have a very special presentation for you this morning, visually rich, as you can already see there on your screen. So Matt Devine was the library's David Scott Mitchell Fellow for 2021. He's been an architect, a curator, an historian and researcher, and he's going to share with us some of those experiences today as he talks us through his project on Ted Farmer, who is the man who I'm sure by the end of 40 minutes you'll appreciate requires more attention than perhaps he has been given over the years. At the conclusion of Matt's talk today, we're going to have some time for a question and answer session. So please just use the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll be back in a little while to ask your questions of Matt. So thanks so much, Matt. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Matt Devine. Rachel gave me a very nice introduction. Just a bit of background about me, which kind of then explains why I went into this body of research. So I'm an architect, a heritage consultant, an academic and a strategic planner. And I've always had a passion for architectural history, and particularly the history of the development of Sydney. And in 2004, I was fortunate to work at the New South Wales Government Architect's Office, which at the time had about 150 staff. And that included architects, landscape architects, urban designers, various types of engineers, quantity surveyors, and all the support staff needed to design buildings, construct buildings, and to provide strategic advice to government. And when I was there a number of years, one colleague of mine, David Burden, identified that 2016 was coming up, and that 2016 represented the 200th anniversary of the organisation. On March 1816, Francis Greenway was appointed civil architect and assistant engineer. That's him on the left there. And from this point on, there's been a succession of architects employed by the state government. There've been slightly varying titles. So Greenway was civil architect and engineer. Then there were several colonial architects, the last possibly being the most famous, James Barnett, followed by the people in the role called government architects, starting with Walter Libsey Vernon. And the current incumbent is Abby Galvin. She's the 24th government architect, appointed in 2019. And she's also the first woman in the role as well. The role of the government architect has generally been responsible for the design of public buildings in New South Wales, courthouses, schools, jails, hospitals, those types of things, plus strategic advice to government on architectural and urban matters. And the government architect usually had a range of support staff, sometimes other architects, sometimes draftspeople, and in my day, as I said, we had a huge range of staff. The office has had several names. Much of the 20th century was the Government Architects Branch. When I was there, it was the Government Architects Office. and has been located in various parts of government, most commonly with Public Works and more recently with the Department of Planning. We had many major plans proposed for 2016, but that changed when the focus of the organisation was changed. But we were still able to put on this fantastic exhibition at the State Library of New South Wales from February to May 2016. I was fortunate to be a co-curator. I really was mainly support staff for the principal curators, Charles Pickett and Margot Riley. And for several months, the exhibition was on display at the library, and some of you may have actually been able to see it. It was divided into several themes. There was the first government architect, law and order, education, building Sydney, landmarks and statements, Sydney's arts buildings, and then a section on the remarkable individuals who had held the position of the government architect until 2016. And it was during this time that I became particularly aware of one government architect who I became quite intrigued by, and that was Herbert Farmer. He was known as Ted, and he became the government architect in 1958. And this image particularly struck me. That's Farmer on the right there, with a bow tie, and I can't quite tell, but he probably has a pipe in his mouth. And he's striding across the formwork of where the state office block was being constructed. This is about 1963. And this is a very typical image of Ted. Long sleeve shirt, sleeves rolled up, bow tie, always a bow tie, and almost always with a pipe in his mouth. This is actually one of the panels from the exhibition. And this is sort of something that I treasure, because this was the whole beginning of my interest in Ted Farmer in particular, and why I actually applied for the David Scott Mitchell Memorial Fellowship. So my principal resource for the fellowship were the 4.265 lineal meters of personal papers that Ted had left to the library. So this is the collection if you want to go and have a look. And in my fellowship application, I noted that Farmer had had a major influence on architectural design and debate across Australia. I noted that my project would be primarily biographical, using his personal papers, but I wanted to provide a nuance to an understanding of the influence that he had on the profession and on architecture in Sydney, New South Wales, and Australia, plus some detailed personal opinions, which are not commonly evident in official documents. The idea was that this would shed light on his personality, his work, and his legacy, and the legacy being primarily the numerous award-winning buildings produced under his time from 58 to 73 as government architect. So Ted was born in 1909 to parents Herbert Farmer and his wife Alice May, who was previously Thistlethwaite. But within a year, his parents separated and he moved to Melbourne with his mother, and they lived with his maternal grandmother and his three maiden aunts, Isabella, Ethel, and Edith Thistlethwaite. He attended Melbourne Grammar School and then studied for his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Melbourne in 1936. Before he graduated, he started working with Leighton Irwin in 1934, and then he actually established the Sydney office for Leighton Irwin in 1936, very soon after graduation. In 1941, he married Dorothy Audrey Gibb, and they lived in a flat in Cremorne until 1947. when they settled in at Glenbrook, and they had 2 children, Anne in 1945 and Peter in 1948. And through this process, I've become quite close to, quite good friends with Peter Farmer, and he's been an amazing resource for my research. So these are some images of Ted at a very young age. This is roughly 1936, so he's 27, and in the office of Leighton, Irwin and Company. He was very keen to work with Leighton Irwin because Leighton had established his practice in Melbourne in 1922, but after 1930, he became a recognised expert in hospital design. And this became Ted's particular expertise as well. And so Ted came to Sydney to set up the office. It was literally only him in the office. He rented a space, but he struggled in the Sydney office and he didn't particularly like it. He was the only employee. He actually wasn't paid very well for a lot of responsibility. And he also didn't enjoy the pressure of running the office with no support. So after 3 years, he joined the Government Architects branch. The image on the screen is actually part of a title block from a fantastic Master of Architecture degree thesis by Russell Jack in 1980, which is the work of the New South Wales Government Architects branch from 58 to 73, which is under Ted's time. And some of the information that I have gleaned is from this thesis, but as I've said, I was trying to look at more at some of the nuances that I would get through the personal papers. So Ted joined the branch in 1939 and he progressed rapidly, focusing primarily on hospital design. After 1947, he was part of the design room established under Cobden Parkes, who was then government architect, and the senior design architect, Harry Rembert. From the mid-1940s, the branch started employing trainees straight out of school. Initially, they got a few applicants, but with increasing reputation, they got many more. And this actually led to an increased caliber of the architects within the branch. In 1960, there were about 100 applicants for 10 positions. And by the end of the 1960s, the branch had established such an impressive reputation for quality work that over 1,500 school leavers applied for 12 positions. So back to the design room, that was established to focus on major projects, and young, innovative design architects were taken from across other parts of the office to work together on these major projects to provide a modern contemporary approach to architecture. So Cobden Parkes, he retired in 1958 and as government architect, and Ted became the government architect, and supposedly he got it over 5 more senior staff. And this is probably where his greatest skill as a facilitator came to the fore. He fostered talented others so great architecture could occur. And also this was the beginning of a time when Ted made the decision that the Government Architects branch should actually enter architectural awards to confirm their, that they were actually doing great work. Cobden Parkes had always felt uncomfortable about the state government entering the New South Wales Architecture Awards, but Ted thought it was okay. And in 1962, the first of many awards were won. In the first instance, it was Fisher Library that you can see on the image here. This won the Sulman Award in association with other architects, T.E. Omani. And it also won a Royal Institute of British Architects Bronze Medal in 1962. Overall, under his leadership, the office won 6 Sulman Awards, which were then the highest architectural award in New South Wales, 2 Blackett Awards, which is generally for regional projects, and numerous merit awards. You have to remember, this was also a period of immense activity in the office. I don't recall exactly how many staff there were at this stage, but probably about 400 or 500, I would say. And there was an increased need across the state for schools, universities, colleges, plus police stations, courthouses, and hospitals. Ted also decided that certain specialist groups were required in the branch. So in 1962, he set up a hospital section under Vic Seelig, a school section under Kirkwood. In 1963, courthouses and the police stations group was set up. The schools research group was formed. In 1968, the landscape group was formed. And this is one of the first formal employment of landscape architects within a government agency in Australia. There was an interior design group that was formalized. There had been interior designers for a number of years prior to 1968, but it was formalized in 1968, this group. The other thing is, because there was so much development required, the branch would often work closely with private architectural practices, often producing concept designs with the detailed documentation by the other practices. So there were over maybe 300 to 400 projects constructed during Ted's tenure as New South Wales Government Architect. And I have a few favourites. This is one of my favourites. This is Robb College, documented in 1959 and completed in 1960. This was designed by Michael Dysart. This is at the University of New England. This is a Max Dupain photo from when it was finished. This is what it looks like, what it looked like in 2019. Most of it had been demolished at that point, which was quite distressing. This is another favourite that a lot of people, well, maybe they won't remember now. I remember very clearly. This was a state office block, which was completed in 1965. Ken Woolley was the design architect. This was actually, there were 3 towers, but this is the one we can see now is the largest tower. It became known as the Black Stump because of the patination of the bronze cladding on the external structure. Very, very beautiful design. This was the first of 3 major office buildings in Sydney by the branch during Farmer's time. Unfortunately, this one also was demolished in 1997. And another favourite of mine is the Grafton office block. This was completed in 1968. A very simple monumental structure, quite modern, very modern in characteristics, with you can see sort of particular elements designed for sun shading. It had a ramp up to what was essentially the first floor because the site is very close to the river in Grafton and floods quite often. And so there is always the problem that the ground floor would flood. So the ground floor was primarily car parking and you entered at first floor. I'm not quite sure why, but for some reason the ramp was removed and you now actually enter down at the lower ground floor, which is a little bit less auspicious. Something else that particularly struck me as interesting about Ted's time as government architect was his sense of the importance of history. And he considered that the government architects branch should be custodian of historic buildings belonging to the state government. And he considered that the responsibility should include the maintenance of these buildings as well as their conservation. Subsequently, Ted was appointed by the Royal Australian Institute of Architects as its representative on the National Trust Council, and he later became their honorary architect. And soon the government architects branch was advising the trust on the conservation of places. In this case, one of the first projects was actually the documentation of a Francis Greenway building. Remember, he was the very first in the line of government architects. This is the St. Matthew's Church at Windsor in 1820, and it was conserved in 1963. The advantage with using the government architects branch was that they were able to provide architectural services, but also connections with older tradespeople who still knew the traditional skills. In the mid-60s, TED actively promoted the idea of some sort of legislation to protect historic buildings, but it took quite a while for that to come to place in New South Wales. The connection with the National Trust led to a series of other strange things, such as the facilitation of the gifting of Lachlan Macquarie's tomb, which you can see here, which is on the Isle of Mull off the coast of Scotland, to the National Trust in New South Wales. Similarly, Farmer was involved in the acquisition of parts of the interiors of Lachlan Macquarie's house, which ended up at Macquarie University, quite strangely. The other connection to the National Trust led to TED attending an international conference in Venice in 1964. This was the second International Congress of Architects and Technicians of Historical Monuments in Venice. And this Congress adopted 13 resolutions, and the first one being what became known as the International Restoration Charter, known as the Venice Charter. This was actually the forerunner of an agreed professional approach to heritage conservation internationally, which then later led to the development of the Borough Charter, which is the recognised standard for heritage conservation used across Australia. Another resolution put forward by UNESCO was that an organisation should be created called the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And this organisation, now known as ICOMOS, is essentially a professional association for promoting standards of heritage conservation internationally. The Congress in Venice was actually part of a much larger trip, over 6 months in total in 1964, where TED and his colleague Vic Seelig, and you might remember Vic was the head of the hospitals division, they travelled across Europe and United States, quite often in first class. You'll see the little F there, investigating hospitals, laboratories, universities, and schools. There are lots of quite wonderful letters that there was, of course, a report written after this period, but possibly of more interest are the letters of this period, in many cases written back to family members, but they actually explain some of the things that TED was looking at and the lessons that he was learning from this. Recent conversations with Peter Farmer actually indicated that TED used to actually, roughly once every 2 weeks, he would have recorded himself describing places where he was and posting them back to the family. As far as we know, Peter Farmer and I, the library doesn't have these, and I don't think they're kept anymore, but that would be quite interesting. This very long trip was incredibly influential for the work that was to come out of the Government Architects branch. And I think there's a whole body of research that could look at the parallels between what they visited and its influence on projects across New South Wales. TED was also government architect during the construction of the Sydney Opera House. He wasn't on the judging panel. Cobden Parkes, his predecessor, was one of the judges on the judging panel that awarded the prize to Jorn Utzon. But Ted, soon after, was needed to be there to continue the process. He was essentially the informed client who acted between Utzon and the politicians. I'm not going to talk too much about the Sydney Opera House, but possibly this is the time that Ted may have been at his most bureaucratic. He was given quite a challenging role because when Utzon resigned, Farmer was given the responsibility to resolve the situation and quickly. So he was quite torn, I imagine. He received a petition from his own staff indicating that Utzon was the only person who could finish the project, but at the same time, he was being pressured by the Minister for Public Works to resolve the issue. In due course, Ted created a company with 3 separate architects with different skills, Hall, Todd and Littlemore, and himself. Ted was part of this company to complete the project. And the project was completed and opened in 1973. This is a challenging time for anyone involved in this project. Peter Hall never really got over the way he was treated after finishing this project. And I wonder whether this has influenced Ted's reputation to date. Ted had some strong personal opinions about Utzon and his role in the situation, and they're quite frank, but I'm not going to share them now, and that's not a sort of conversation today. And this is possibly one of the opening of the Sydney Opera House is possibly one of my earliest memories. We were living in Condobolin in October 1973. Our TV broke down, so we went to watch the opening of the Opera House on our neighbour's house to watch the celebrations. From conversations with Peter Farmer, who was Ted's son, it is clear that Ted was waiting for the Opera House to be completed before he retired. This is a photo from the government, the state office building, state office block. I'm not quite sure if this is Ted's office, and this is very soon before he retired. I like to think it was his office because considering how responsible he became for the completion of the Opera House, it would be a good way to look out on the view. Chris Johnson, who was the government architect in 2001, when Ted passed away, he quoted Ted in saying something that Ted had said upon his retirement. Just keeping in mind that Ted, he was very proud of his achievements. I flatter myself that the branch has achieved an aim that was always before me, and that is to lead the profession both in aesthetic and practical aspects. The public recognition that we have received both in Australia and overseas is proof of this. I think our status was never higher. At the time of his retirement and soon after, Ted was widely recognised for the many things that he had achieved as government architect during his period, 58-73. One of them is the Royal Australian Institute of Architects Gold Medal, and this is a photo of the medal that I took recently. The Gold Medal, this is the Institute of Architects' highest honour. It recognises distinguished service by architects who have designed or executed buildings of high merit, producing work of great distinction that has advanced architecture or endowed the profession in a distinguished manner. Here's quite a wonderful photo of Ted being awarded the Gold Medal. That's Cobden Parkes, who was his predecessor as government architect, to his right. And the president of the Institute of Architects is actually wearing the very elegant silver chains of the president's chains, which are actually designed by Jorn Utzon. In 1976, Ted became a commander of the British Empire, and here's his, I'm not quite sure what you call that. And also in 1976, Ted received an honorary doctorate from the University of Melbourne. And this comes back to where my research started. During his period as government architect, possibly more great buildings were built by that office than at any other time. And they certainly won more awards. So why wasn't Ted better known? So everyone knows the name of the first government architect, Francis Greenway, possibly of the late 19th century Barnett and early 20th century Vernon, but less of Farmer. Part of me was wondering, was this because the projects are more recent, more modern, and less appreciated? It's only in the last 20 years that modern architecture is becoming recognized and valued quite the same way that Victorian and Federation and interwar architecture is. I sometimes wondered whether it was because Ted Farmer was caught up in the Opera House drama, similar to, but not as to the same extent that the Sydney Opera House situation had on the career, reputation, and life of Peter Hall. I sometimes wonder whether it's a sort of jealousy from the remaining peers who are still alive, or ones who have written about his life. It was interesting, when I mentioned this project to a colleague, she scoffed, stating that Farmer wasn't even an architect. And this confused me. Of course he was an architect. The skills of an architect are quite broad. And of course, he didn't design many buildings in the later part of his life, but he certainly facilitated them and worked closely with various organizations, not least politicians, politicians of all levels, to make this happen. I still want to find out more about why his reputation has diminished, if not tarnished. The other part of this project was I wanted to find out who Ted Farmer really was. From reading the correspondence, and there is a lot of correspondence, and reading his speeches and things written about him, looking at his work, it's very clear that he was highly intelligent. He was fairly complex, relatively organized, and he could be very charming. He was clearly very opinionated, and this particularly comes through in his correspondence, but he also knew when to share his opinion. He also was a family man. He loved his wife Dorothy, and children Anne and Peter. He made the decision soon after getting married to live in Glenbrook, and so for almost 40 years, traveled to Sydney every day until his retirement, probably closer to 30 years actually. We know that conversations with Peter indicated that he had seats booked on particular trains, a particular train in the morning, particular train in the evening, and he occasionally stayed in the city for events or meetings. He was an obsessive letter writer and a keeper of received letters. And the other thing is, when his mother and aunt passed away, he actually then had all the letters that he had written to them as well. He also loved making things. And I wondered whether this was as a result of living through the Depression, but there's lots of documents and information about how to make a wireless radio, how to make a photo enlarger. And when he moved to Glenbrook, there was always something to be made, fixed, created. This is quite a late photo of Ted, one of the latest ones that I've seen. This was from Peter Farmer's family. As part of this exercise, though, I learned a lot about him, and there were some things that I didn't particularly like to learn. And I know I'm showing my sort of background and bias, but I don't like the fact that Ted loved guns and hunting. And there are lots of references to this in his correspondence, including detailed notes about him trying to justify keeping his pistol in his mid-80s. I also fear that he was slightly misogynistic. I don't have much evidence of this, but again, he was a product of his time, so maybe I can excuse this. While my fellowship is about to end, I know that my journey with Farmer hasn't. I haven't completed everything I wanted to do. COVID got in the way, and other 3 jobs and other aspects of life just kind of intervened. So I still want to know more, and I especially want to contact some of his peers to talk about him. I want to thank the State Library for the amazing opportunity as a David Scott Mitchell Memorial Fellow for 2022, Associate Professor Cameron Logan for his advice and direction, and particularly Peter Farmer and his wife Anne for their kindness and support. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Matt. More bow ties on work sites, yeah?
Okay, I think so.
So people are starting to ask questions. If you have anything you'd like to quiz Matt about, just pop some notes into the chat and we'll get through as many as we can. So people are asking about the state office block, and someone suggested that the windows were higher up so that the dear old public servants beavering away inside couldn't stare out. Did you have any comments that you'd like to make about the design of that tower?
That was a sort of a fairly common thing in sort of office buildings of this time, particularly ones that aren't for commercial rent lease. We believe that was one of the reasons why there are only very high windows in the UTS tower, so that the students weren't distracted. But at the same time, there are various components of state office block. Anne-Marie suggested that maybe that was from the function room at the top, but there were various boardrooms and executive wings. So maybe it was part of one of those spaces. I do like to think, though, that Ted did have a view of the Opera House from his office, because it certainly was a big investment of his time.
Yeah. We're just going to return to fashion very briefly. Someone is asking, why are architects so very fond of the bow tie? And they're suggesting that no other occupation has made the bow tie as popular.
Okay, well, there is a very particular reason why architects are popular bow ties and why it's not so relevant now. Bow ties were, if you are drawing with ink and you're leaning over your drawing board, if you had a tie, you would, let alone ruining your tie, you'd smudge your drawing, and that's much worse. Because in the old days, which I know very well, you were drawing on very unpleasant paper that then has to be scratched out, and then you need to rub the surface, and it's never going to be the same again. So you don't want to smudge the ink on your drawing. That's actually a reason why left-handed people often were necessarily not quite as good at drawing on architectural drawings, because they smudge it as well. But that's why bow ties, architects always wore bow ties for that reason. Yeah, by that stage though, Ted wasn't drawing anything, but he was still wearing his bow tie. In some particular architectural practices, they wore bow ties and a dust jacket, just to make sure you didn't get any ink on your clothes as well.
So anyway, attractive and practical.
Very practical.
Some people are just giving lots of feedback about how informative your presentation was. Your enthusiasm is infectious.
Oh, good.
Somebody is asking if you get a sense of how Farmer felt about all the emigre architects arriving in the public service during his tenure.
It's interesting. I haven't actually come across many references to that. He did write some very patchy memoirs at certain periods of his life, and he does talk about some of his colleagues at the time, but he was very pragmatic, and if you were good at what you did and didn't waste time, he would have actually appreciated what you brought to it. Mm-hmm. And because we know he had the big trip in '64 where he was experiencing a lot of like the work of in Europe in particular, he would be very happy for the information that those architects were bringing to the practice. The other thing is, a lot of the trainee architects who later became very famous architects in their own right, Ken Woolley, Michael Dysart, Andrew Anderson, Peter Weber, a lot of them, after they finished their traineeship, actually studied abroad or did significant periods of travel, but their position in the organization was retained to encourage their broadening of their experience, which they could then bring back to the practice. So I will keep looking for sort of particular references to emigre architects, but I can't see why he would have. I think he would have really appreciated their input, particularly if they worked hard, though.
So we have a collection question. So you've mentioned a couple of times this morning material here at the library and also the private papers that are still within the family.
Yep.
And just asking about where the bulk of this material is and how accessible it might be.
So the bulk of the material is in the library, but you have to remember these are personal papers. So things that were considered as important government papers, they are generally at state records. Yep. And I haven't ventured into that yet. And even only in the last, I think, 10 years, certain components from the papers at the library were actually sent to state records because they were perceived as appropriate things for the government to have a repository. So these, and I was a bit taken aback initially because I knew that they were personal papers, but I didn't quite register the extent of how many letters that he wrote as a 15-year-old to his mother and her back, which are fine to read on a certain level as background information, but they kind of weren't really helping me understand his influence and his opinions about what was going on. Later letters are very informative when, for example, he's very critical of the work of a particular firm of architects who are doing work at RPA, saying, well, our branch could have done it for a lot cheaper and it would have looked as good. So things like that. So those sorts of things are quite telling. And so these come up, and as I said, he's frank in his opinions in his correspondence. And that's probably the real advantage of the personal papers. Professional papers, there would be vast numbers of those at the state records. But I was able to get enough of it through what was in the library. There's still a few things that are not publicly accessible as yet, because there's sort of concerns with sort of just some slightly cautious information in there, mostly about the Opera House. I was fortunate through my relationship with Peter to be able to get access to some of that. And the family mainly just have photos and certificates and a clock, a very nice clock that says Government Architect written on it. If only we'd known about that for the exhibition, we would have definitely wanted it. Yeah, so that sort of, it's mostly, as I said, the personal papers are the ones I use, and they're mostly in the State Library.
So somebody's asking a really interesting question. You've mentioned today about how he became more bureaucratic as his career went on, but are you able to talk about his personal aesthetic as an architect? And if you sense he ever felt frustrated by the practicality of working for the government and doing sort of quite useful buildings rather than buildings that may have been designed to beautify a city, perhaps?
Well, I think firstly, he felt that there didn't need to be a distinction between beautiful and practical, and that one of the characteristics of a lot of the work of that period is it's very robust, quite monumental, lots of concrete, brickwork, but often in quite vaguely classical proportions, columns along a front, symmetrical, entrances in the middle. So which are kind of almost standard principles of sort of beauty and aesthetics. His own work tended to fit into that mold. I must say that I haven't found huge numbers of buildings that are attributed to him directly, and most of them are okay. I don't think they're particularly fantastic. As I said, I don't. Yeah, so I think he was very much a product of his time. He was increasingly interested in new technology, new materials, contemporary design, and what could be learned from other places. So yeah, maybe I need to check out some more of things that I know are exactly his. I know he did quite a few buildings up at University of New England. He had a very strong connection with the university in Armidale, or even before it came to university. And I was looking at some photos of Dixon Library that is attributed to him, but it has had, which is at UNE, but it has had many alterations, and I'm trying to work out what bit was Ted's and what bit wasn't. So.
Somebody's asking about demolition. So you mentioned a couple of buildings today that are no longer available to go and look at. And I know that urban renewal is much more complicated than who actually put a building up. But is there a sense that you get that for some of these government buildings, they are easier in many instances, or there's a perception that it's easier to just pull them down, whether it's just they want the real estate or it doesn't fit in with a particular streetscape anymore, or it's just there's some sort of stigma attached to it because it was a government building?
Yes. No, I'm going to try and say things that won't get me into too much trouble. But I think it's very clear that government-owned buildings, modern government-owned buildings, are actually in much more threat than ones owned by the private sector. Think of large areas of demolition of Darling Harbour, State Office Block. I was actually at a talk last week, which was about the sort of it was a sort of very depressing talk about what modern buildings have been demolished in the last 20 years, and it was a vast range of them. At one stage, Ku-ring-gai College, UTS Ku-ring-gai, was likely to be demolished. Thankfully, it was retained, but any number of them have gone. The State Office Block was demolished supposedly because it had asbestos in it, but any building of that period has asbestos in it, and you just watch it and manage it, or you replace it. I think it was an opportunity to sell off a site for a large sum of money, personally. And I think that is often the case. Buildings owned by the state government, I think, are probably actually more under threat than others.
And so this is a follow-up question that somebody's asking about that. So apart from, you mentioned the unique networks that the Government Architect's Office has with regard to old school trades that might be difficult for other firms to access. What specifically about government-built buildings offer us as a community, as a user, and I've just lost the lighting in here, but also for architectural history, and what we can learn from them for a next generation of...
I suppose one of the good things is that even just the government architect's work alone, there is buildings that date from, I think, 1819, I think is the earliest one, until the present day. And so even just from that collection of buildings, which is still a vast collection, there is a range of buildings that we can learn, sort of understand techniques and technology, materials, methods that we can understand buildings from the whole of European settlement within Australia, with buildings basically owned and built by the state government. The question about the connections to traditional trades, that was very much something that was an important part of public works, as it was particularly from Ted's time. And there is still a public works stone yard that actually has a lot of these tradespeople on board. For a long time, for example, the skill of stonemasonry for building work had almost died out until public works fostered that skill, and a large number of the stonemasons across New South Wales at least trained in the public works stone yard. So there is a role for the government to facilitate this ongoing knowledge and to also keep these buildings so that we have a better understanding of the history, of architectural history in New South Wales and Australia.
And somebody's asking, what sort of buildings are the Government Architect's Office working on now? So what are some of the recent examples of their output?
So since 2016, in 2016, the Government Architect's Office went through a radical shift, which did also happen to be the 200th anniversary year. They went in 2015, there were 120 staff. By mid-2016, there were 3 staff. And they went from public works, which was part of Finance Services and Administration, one of those big agencies, to planning. So the Government Architect's Office now primarily has a strategic advice role. And they now have, I think, about 20 staff, so they are back up again. But they're not actually sort of designing things per se. They're facilitating design excellence. They're giving advice to departments about what should be done. For example, they reviewed the Macquarie Street East Precinct Master Plan. They commission other architects to do studies for them, but they're actually not building many things. The last few things that were actually built were probably a series of schools that were completed in about 2016. Those were some of the last things that were actually built by the Government Architect's Office.
Okay, and somebody's asking, we'll sneak this in as the very last question before we wrap up for today. What is next for you and Ted Farmer? You said you haven't finished.
Oh, yes. It's interesting. Late in my research, I actually made contact with the family, and I know I should have done that much earlier on, but that has actually been a really worthwhile exercise and immensely satisfying. And they're actually quite excited with this, with what I've been doing too. Peter in particular, his daughter Anne passed away. Peter, his son, is kind of like the keeper of his legacy, and he's very interested in his father's work, and that someone else is interested in his work. I am intending to write some conference papers. This may even lead to a PhD, who knows? We'll see. I can't promise anything until I renovate a house. Yeah, there's certainly, it's really just the beginning.
Well, that's great to hear. So thank you very much for what you've shared with us.
Thank you. Thanks to the library. It's been a wonderful opportunity
today. And for those of you who were keen beans this morning and signed on a little bit early, you would have seen that we were trying to wrangle our way through some end of season, end of year technical glitches. It's like we think it's all running smoothly and then it's not. Matt also had a few problems which he swiftly overcame with the quick deployment of an emergency iPad this morning. So he's been running this all from a very tiny little screen and doing a fab job. Thank you all very much for coming and for your questions. And before I sign off, I would like to thank my colleagues here at the library. I just sort of swan in at a little bit before 11 and chat to the fellows and facilitate your questions, but there are lots of people who make it all happen behind the scenes. So thanks very much to my colleagues Lydia Tasker, Marcelo Flaxbard, and a special shout out to Emily Murish, who is usually our very cool and collected stage manager, coming up with all sorts of great solutions to make sure that we go to air on time. And she also coordinates our volunteers here at the library, and they have been beavering away applying captions to our scholar talks. So watch out for those next year if you missed anything in our 2022 season. We do hope to have those available online on the library's website. We're taking a little bit of a break now. We'll be back on the 7th of February. Again, the first Tuesday of the month at 11, we'll be doing our scholar talks with our fellows and with a few special guests. So in February, it's great to have Dr. Meg Foster coming in, and she'll be talking about boundary crosses and some of the more unusual bushrangers in Australia's criminal history. We like a good crime story here at the library. So it will be great to have her. And of course, it will be wonderful to have your company again in 2023. Until then, stay safe, and I hope to see you on site or online at the library. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Matt.
Bye.